scientific expression, level of magnification. Change your magnification on your skin, take out a magnifying glass, and you don't see the familiar skin anymore. You see all the pores with hairs sticking out of them. Change it again and get a microscope, and you see cellular structure. Get an ion microscope, and you see molecules. And we know by other methods of observation that it can get smaller and smaller and smaller, and that the spaces between these minute units are so vast that they're comparable to the distances between the sun and the planets in scale. So also with time. So in this sense, there could be vast, vast universes full of empires and battleships and palaces and brothels and restaurants and orchestras in the tip of your fingernail. And on the other hand, we could be all going on in the tip of somebody else's fingernail. It's very important to understand not only the relativity of size and of time, but also of what there is. Now, as you know, the human senses respond only to a very small band of the known spectrum of vibrations. We know through instruments of quite a vast spectrum, but we, as I say, with our senses, see only a little of it. If our senses were in some way altered, we would see a rather different looking world. We can do this, of course. We can put on special lenses to enable us to see heat. And then we see all the heat radiations coming out of people. And we say, well, I never noticed that about you before. But so in the same way, you see, there are infinitely many possibilities of vibration and of organs sensitive to those vibrations, so that there could be worlds within worlds within worlds, spaces within spaces, just like the many, many wavelengths of radio and television, going on forever and ever in all directions. The possibilities are infinite. But having senses and noticing is a selective process. It picks out only certain ones, just as when you play the piano. You don't take both arms and slam down all keys at once. You select. And so perception is a kind of piano playing. It is picking out certain things as significant, that is to say, as constituting patterns. And the whole universe seems to be a process of playing with different patterns. But whatever it does, whatever it plays, in whatever dimension, on whatever scale of time or space, it's all on the self. And the self is also known in Sanskrit as Brahman. This is a neuter word. Brahman is from the root BRH, which means to expand, to grow. It isn't quite clear exactly why this word was chosen. Sometimes there's a still better word for the self, which I like, is the word tat. Almost like tit for tat. Tat. Tat means that. We get our word that from the Sanskrit tat. And so when the baby comes into being, first of all, the first thing it says is da. Da. The baby is pointing. Da, da, da. And it's saying that. Look, isn't that marvelous? That. You see? So that is the witch than which there is no witcher. And so you get the formula in this Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Tat Tvam Asi, which means Tat, that, Tvam, Latin, you, Asi, are. You are that. Or that thou art. That art thou. So, in this sense then, every self is modeled on and is an expression of the one self, because you all feel individually that you're the center of the world. And everything else is seen in circles, circling out, sphering out from where you are. And that's, as it were, you call them microcosm, the little cosmos. But then in the same way, the macrocosm has a central self, although this is not central in the way we talk about centers in space. Do you see that? A center of a circle is in the middle of the circle, and the circumference is away from it. But you could use a phrase that the Christian theologians have used of God, that circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. You could speak of Brahman that way. It isn't in the middle of the universe, spatially speaking. You might ask the question, where is the universe? Ever thought of that one? Where is it? Well, you can't say where, because everywhere has to be in relation to something. There would have to be another universe to say where this one is. But then, since those two together would constitute the universe, we wouldn't still be able to say where it was. It isn't anywhere. And so in that sense, the center isn't anywhere in space locally. And furthermore, the kind of space we are dealing with is only one possible kind of space. It's the kind of space our physical organisms are attuned to. We are, you see, like the radio. We pick up what wavelength we're on. So then, when inquirers used to come to that great modern Hindu saint, Sri Ramana Maharshi, and they'd ask him all sorts of silly questions, like, who was I in my last incarnation? What will I be in my next one? He would always reply, who is asking the question? Who are you? Find out, because that's the thing you need to know. As it were, dig down into the depths of your being and say, what is this that I call I? That's one of the very fascinating questions. It teases us out of thought to think about death in the sense of going to sleep and never waking up. Imagine that. And you find you can't. And yet, it's a thought that although you can't get to grips with it, it remains fascinating. Also the question, how is it suddenly that you awakened into this world? Where were you before? In Zen Buddhism, they have the meditation problem, the koan. Before your father and mother conceived you, what is your original nature? And that's the same sort of weird question as what it would be like to go to sleep and never wake up. What was it like to wake up having not previously gone to sleep? It's very mysterious. But as you go on and plumb this question, you begin to develop the feeling that your existence is exceedingly odd. In many ways odd. Odd because it is here and it so easily might not have been. After all, if your father hadn't met your mother, would you be here? Now, of course, somebody would be here, because he might have met somebody else. Would that be you? Of course it would. Don't you see? You can only be you by being someone. But every someone is you. Every someone is I. That's your name, you say. It's me. I am here. And everybody feels that I in the same way. It's the same feeling. Just like blue everywhere is the same color. So I-ness being, as it were, the most fundamental thing in man is also fundamental to the universe. It too is I. And our I is a special case of it, coming out from the, in quotes, central I, like so many tits from the belly of a sow, or so many spines from a sea urchin, so many legs from a spider. And that is, of course, why the images of the Hindu gods are shown with many arms or many faces, because it is saying that all arms are the arms of the divinity. All faces are its masks. So, you see, there's really nothing to worry about. Because the important you is perfectly indestructible. It's what there is. Now, of course, a Hindu like Krishnamurti would say you must be very careful about beliefs like that, because you may be using this idea of an eternal self, which is the real self in you, as an escape, as an expression of your fear of ceasing to be. And indeed, most beliefs are used in that way. People commonly say, I need a religion because I need something to hang on to. Now, if you need something to hang on to, you have not got religion, because you've got the opposite of faith. Faith is not a state of hanging on to something. Faith is a state of letting go. So you see, lots of people like to have a very definite idea of God. They want to be able to think of him as a benevolent old gentleman with a big beard who's very kindly and loving, or at least some sort of spirit of high moral character, depending on what you mean by morals. And so they believe that God is like that. But you see, the Hindus start by getting rid of beliefs. That, I said, to know the self, you must get every idea out of your head about what the self could be. That doesn't mean you cease to have ideas about how to cook bread. It means that you abandon all ideas of the self, because that creates a transparent state of mind in which and through which the self can become manifest. So believing in it isn't the point. The point is knowing it. And either you know it or you don't. And when you do know it, there's no question of believing in it, because you know it. But before you know it, it doesn't really help you to believe in it. That's too bad. So you mustn't believe anything I say about the self, that is. I can, in every word, I express it, but in no word do I describe it. You see, that's the teeth can't bite themselves bit. So, this is, of course, a comforting idea in a certain sense, that our comings and goings, our fortunes and misfortunes are a sort of mirage. As indeed they are. The more we know about them, the more we know about the world, the more diaphanous it seems. The only reason I can't push my pen through the floor is the floor is going so fast that the pen doesn't go through it. Like a revolving electric fan, you have some difficulty putting your finger through, and if you persist, you damage your finger. So in the same way, if you bang your head against the granite wall, you damage your head. But it's because the granite wall is going so fast. Only it's going so fast in a very small area. All those molecules are running around to beat the band. And that's why it's so strong. In sloppier things like air, it's not so fast. And so you can get through, because you're going faster than the air. So it is. But it's all something going... And if I do that fast enough, I go from... I'm still vibrating. Only you don't hear the intervals. If I do it slowly, you hear the spaces between. But make it fast enough, and the ear is trained to notice the crests of the wave of sound rather than the troughs. But it's still vibrating. Everything's vibrating. And therefore, everything in the world has the characteristics of smoke. You know, when you blow a cigarette or pipe or something and a cloud of smoke and you see it in the sunbeam, and it's full of whorls and designs and all kinds of marvelous things going on, and then slowly it disappears. Well, everything's just like that. So if you say, now there are two attitudes you can take to that state of affairs. You can say sour grapes. It's all a lousy, wretched trap. And here I am, I'm given all these feelings of love and attachment and joy of life, and then I fall apart. My teeth drop out, my eyes become feeble, I get cancer or cirrhosis of the liver or something, and then it all falls apart, and it's too bad. Therefore, don't become attached to things. Don't enjoy life. Treat it, holding it off like that, just like a very, very firm person who's been jilted and says, never again will I get mixed up with the opposite sex, or with love, because love hurts. But on the other hand, a weaving of smoke can be very beautiful, provided you don't lean on it, provided you don't try to preserve it, catch hold of it. Then you destroy it. So exactly the same way, there's nothing in the way of form that you can lean on, that you can grasp. And if you see that, then the world of form is very beautiful. If you let it go, to love people, you see, if you're husband and wife, you must let each other go. Otherwise, the marriage is either going to break up or it's going to be hell. If you love a person, you say to that person, look, I love you, whatever that may be. I've seen quite a bit of it, and I know there's lots that I haven't seen, but still it's you, and I want you to be what you want to be. And I won't be happy if I've got you in a cage. You'll be a bird without song. So no cages around here, no balls and chains. Then, you see, they love each other. And they're likely to go on loving each other. But if they wrap each other up with all sorts of ties and chains and documents and things, then they are not on a very safe basis. The very firm words of those documents belie the situation, because nobody curses and swears and kisses the Bible and all sorts of things like that if he means yes. If there's some doubt that he means yes, then he's asked what they call this rituals of cursing and swearing and signing on dotted lines and putting the seal and something. indicates doubt right at once. It just does a fly in the ointment from the beginning. So when the Hindu and Buddhist philosophers speak of detachment from all this apparent world of separate beings, some of them take a rather grim attitude about it, as if they had been jilted. But the real meaning is it's not a put-down word to say that the world is a nasty thing. It's saying, really, that detachment means going with this whole thing and not resisting its change. That doesn't mean, of course, that you become totally flabby, because you wouldn't notice what change is unless there were certain interruptions in it. In other words, if a flower grew too fast, popped like that, we'd hardly notice it. It grows slowly, because there are all sorts of little tensions in it holding back. Just when you grow, or when a tree grows, the bark contains the tree and holds it in and offers a little resistance, you see. But it expands in time too. So there's always going out and holding back in change. So to go with that, though, and you can afford to go with it, you can afford to get mixed up in life and to fall in love and to get involved with all sorts of things. You can afford it if you know that it's an illusion. But this is not illusion in a bad sense of the word. Here's this Hindu word, crucial. The world is called Maya. From the root, mat. This word, Maya, yes, it means illusion. It means magic. It means art. It means delineation or measurement. And so from matra we get meter. And we also get matter, material. Isn't it funny that when we say material, today we mean something very real, whereas the root of the word is illusion. So, you see, measurement is kind of an illusion. You don't find inches lying around. You can't pick up an inch. And you can't do anything with an hour. It has to be an hour of something. It has to be an inch of something. So, in the same way that hours and inches and pounds and dollars and so on are actually imaginary. They're elaborate systems of cosmic bookkeeping with their little scratches on paper, little hairlines on dials. So, in exactly that way, the distinction between things is Maya, is imaginary. But what an imagination. See? So, in a way, to say that the world is Maya is at the same time to say that what lies behind Maya is immaterial. Look at the reversal of the word. Oh, it's immaterial. Doesn't matter. What matters? It's all this. But now, that gets us to a deeper point yet. The self, the real self, doesn't matter. Which is another way of saying it doesn't exist for any purpose. It doesn't need to exist for any purpose. What purpose would it exist for? When it's what there is. It won't find anything in the future, has nothing in the past that it has to go back and remember. Is now, an eternal now. And so in that way, it doesn't matter. But therefore, The most important thing in the universe is the one thing that doesn't matter, the one thing that's totally and completely useless, and that nobody can find anything for. Once a Zen master was asked, what is the most valuable thing in the world? And he answered, the head of a dead cat. Why? Because no one can put a price on it. So this self, the Brahman, is like the head of a dead cat. But you see, if then you say, I really ought to get that dead cat's head, because something spiritual about it, and it'd be very good for me. After all, if I knew the self, I might be a better person. People might like me more. I'd be more constructive in society. I would do this, that, and the other. You see, that's putting the cart before the horse. That's trying to make the tail wag the dog. The knowledge of Brahman, the self, never does anybody any good if they're trying to make it do them some good. Only when they're not concerned with whether it does them any good or not, does it do them any good. It's like when you relax and you go out and play. Americans in particular don't know how to do this because they're always justified. They always say it's good for me. It's exercise. It is to change from work, and that'll be able to make me work better. See? Everything they do is done for some serious reason. It's the Protestant conscience. And so we never play, except very exceptionally, because play is that which is done just for itself, for fun. So the self, the Atman, the Brahman, exists for fun. It has no reason to exist. It's completely useless. And it is, therefore, Maya is linked with the word Leela. Leela. And that means play. Also, of course, the word illusion in English is derived from the Latin ludere, to play. So, the nature, you might say, of the self is that it does no work. It only plays. Work is something serious, that you do for a purpose, because you believe that you've got to go on living. You work to survive, because you think you have to survive. That was one of the things they told you as a little child. You've got to go on, man. But you don't have to. This thing doesn't have to go on. That's why it does. I know that sounds paradoxical, but there's so many things in life that are like that. If I'm trying to impress people, I usually don't. If you try too hard with anything, you usually make a mess of it. You have to play it. Like when you're fishing, and you get a fish on the line, you can't just drag it out of the water. You have to play that fish, like that. And so, this basic thing then is that the self, the Brahman behind the world, is engaged in play. It is in this sense that the Hindu philosophers say Brahman does not actually become the world. The meaning of that is he is playing at being it, or it's playing at being it, as distinct from working at it. And so in certain Oriental countries, when one refers to noble people of high birth, it is often said, so Lord so-and-so has died. The Japanese would say he has played at dying. Or will he play at taking a journey to Tokyo? So, also, remember this, although I've constantly used in this talk the word one to apply to the self and central, the Hindus don't use this word except speaking poetically and loosely. The self is not one. The self is called non-dual. Because you see, the idea of one has an opposite. The opposite of one is many, or none. But the which than which there is no whicher has no opposite. There's nothing outside it. So you can't call it one. Because one is an exclusive idea. It excludes two. So they call it, instead of one, they call it non-dual, which is Advaita. This is from the word, you see, Deva is the root meaning two. It's in our, the V becomes U, so we get dual. And A is the meaning in Sanskrit often non. Non-dual, Advaita. And so it doesn't exclude anything. One is an exclusive word. Advaita is meant to be a totally inclusive kind of unity. Now, of course, this word itself, when you look at it from a logical standpoint, is a dualistic word, just like one. It's the opposite of Dvaita, Dvaita and Advaita. But the idea here in Indian philosophy is to use this word in a certain way. Now, you know that on a flat surface, you can't draw 3 dimensions. Anything you draw will be in 2 dimensions. But when we do this, we're in 2 dimensions. Now, if I want to put that in 3 dimensions, all I have to do is this. And you see a telephone pole on a road. Why? Why do we see 3 dimensions? Because of an artistic convention called one-pointed perspective, which will give you the illusion of a 3rd dimension. Now, in other words, a 2-dimensional line is being used to imply a 3rd dimension which can never be expressed on a flat surface. So in exactly the same way, Advaita is a word used specially to designate what lies beyond all logical categories. Perhaps the simplest way in which one can express Advaita is this. Take a piece of paper, and it clearly has 2 different sides. Only by the elaborate joke of the Möbius strip in mathematical topology can you make a one-sided piece of paper. But in all ordinary cases, a piece of paper has 2 quite different sides. But these 2 different sides are inseparable. You don't have one without the other. There is, therefore, shall we say, a secret conspiracy between the 2 sides of a piece of paper, always to be found together. Only, what is this? You see, when you get your boxes, every inside has an outside, and they go together. It's that going together that is non-duality. It expresses itself as duality, but all dualities that we know go together. And that is the non-duality that is the secret link between them. So then we are continuing with the subject of Mahayana Buddhism. And in the last seminar, I discussed almost entirely the school of Mahayana, which is known as Madhyamika in Sanskrit, this word meaning approximately the middle way. Madhyamika
has been called in the best book that there is on the subject, the central philosophy of Buddhism. And is not what we call in the West a philosophy at all. It's a method for changing your state of consciousness. In other words, it's not a system of ideas such as propounded, say, by Plato or by Kant or by Hegel. It's a dialectical method. That is to say, dialectic being in the sense of a discourse between a teacher and a student, the purpose of which is not to explain or inculcate a certain set of ideas, but to change one's basic state of feeling. That is to say, to change the sensation that you have of your own existence. All Buddhism is concerned with this. What is the very crux of Buddhism, the thing that is called Bodhi, B-O-D-H-I, which means awakening. It comes from the same root as the word Buddha, B-O-D-H, Bud, or B-U-D-H, Bud, is to know, but better to be awake. You know, some of you have probably exposed yourselves to the teachings of Gurdjieff, the wonderful old rascal, who used to give lectures in which he would keep completely silent for a while and get everybody embarrassed. And then, you know, they were all expecting something to happen, and he would look individually at everybody in the group. And when everybody was feeling awkward, he would say, "Wake up!" "You're all asleep. And if you don't wake up, I won't give any lecture." And this is a very good attitude, actually. Zen, as you know, uses shock tactics of various kinds. And the whole idea then is that a person who is under illusion, maya, thinks of himself basically as a victim. Someone caught in a trap. Somebody subject to fate, the will of God, or whatever you want to call it, who got involved in life passively. That's why I use the word victim. And he has this, therefore, the sensation of his consciousness as being a kind of passive, but nevertheless very delicate and tender receptor or percipient of everything that goes on, so that life in general occurs to you. It happens to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And you say, well, it's awful. I can't get myself out of this trap. So the technique of the philosophical dialogue that I was describing as a Madhyamika is to get you to drop your defenses. In other words, you can discover as practically a physical sensation that you tend to be on the defensive all the time. You are exerting through every muscle, practically, a resistance against the world, all of which is excessive. In other words, you need a certain resistance. You need a certain muscular tonus. But your body does that for you. You don't need to will it. It's like if you lie on the floor and relax, you don't need to do anything to hold yourself together. The floor will hold you up, and your skin will hold you inside. But most people are actually doing things to hold themselves together, even in this situation of complete relaxation, because they don't really trust their own life. And that is the lack of trust in one's own life, the perpetual attitude of defensiveness, is a result of a kind of misfeeling of one's own existence as something alien to the universe that endures, as I said, and is simply a passive recipient of experience. So then, the whole process of a therapeutic dialogue, which was invented by this marvelous man, Nagarjuna, in the following of the Buddha, because it's a strange thing that the Buddha was very, very creative towards other people. That is to say, the basic idea of Buddhism does not preclude other people being just as much Buddha as Buddha was. There's a little difficulty in Christianity about this, you see, because everybody harks back to the Christ as the unique and only incarnation of God. And so he is on a very special pedestal, which nobody else is ever allowed to climb up on. And this, of course, makes the teaching and work of Jesus completely ineffective. But Buddhism had the advantage that they never did that. And so that Nagarjuna, who could come later than Buddha, was in a way a wiser man than the Buddha himself. But only because he stood on the shoulders of Buddha and carried the Buddha's dialogue to its full not its full conclusion, but to a full conclusion. We can go further today. You see, this thing hasn't stopped at all. It isn't something that we go back to as a past and say, well, we're going to tell you all about a thing called Buddhism, which is a fixed body of practices and beliefs in which certain people in Asia believe, and if you're interested, you can believe in it too. It's not like that at all. It's an activity that is going on, and when it gets mixed up in the context of Western civilization, Western science, Western technology, will do things that the Asian people never dreamed of and might not even approve of. So it's very important in approaching this. This is one of our difficulties, you see. If I were a lecturer on Buddhism in the context of the academic world, I would have to observe certain game rules. That is to say, I would have to discuss the subject as entirely historical, as something of the past, and I would be expected to give you extremely accurate information about what it was, what other people thought, and what they did. The moment I began to suggest that this thing had any vitality to it and might have some effect upon you, I would be ruled out as academically unrespectable. They would say, well, this man is no longer qualified to be a professor because he is advocating these things and not taking an objective point of view to it. You see, it's very funny. All obsolete subjects are studied by the historical method. So if you study in the university religion, it comes under the heading of the history of religions. Philosophy, the introductory course in philosophy is usually history of philosophy. Just imagine teaching children mathematics with the introductory course, History of Mathematics, so that they would start doing sums in Egyptian and Roman numerals, and going through all the procedures that ancient man went through to arrive at modern mathematics. Imagine a first course in medicine. They proceed immediately to practical matters, the most up-to-date knowledge of the human physiology, and they teach that. Only when you become a graduate school in the history of medicine do you run across an elective course in the history of medical science. So, this way of putting everything at a distance of history is a way of castrating it, making it completely ineffective, so that it won't do anything anymore. So that's why I, for example, cannot work in the academic world. Because although I know their game rules and how to study Buddhism from the historical method, when you get involved in that after a while, nobody's interested. It just becomes completely boring. You can acquire yourself a huge library and you can go into the facts endlessly. And then what? So, but the thing that the academicians can console themselves with is that the one thing they are very much afraid of is a teacher of religion who's out to convert people. Because that, you see, is imposing upon you a particular individual and subjective point of view. So if, in other words, a person who is teaching Christianity should start preaching from his academic chair, instead of just saying what Christians did and so on in such and such a period, they would be very frightened of that. But the advantage that a Buddhist has is that he has no opinions that he is trying to put over on you. He's only trying to help you to get rid of your opinions. That is to say, to get rid of any fixed view of the world and of yourself. Because we use what are called views, in Sanskrit, drishti, as methods of clinging to existence. So there is something that is called in Sanskrit Sakaya Drishti. S-A-K-A-Y-A, Sakaya Drishti, which means the view of separateness, the view of your being, this thing that I was talking about, the separate, insular recipient of experience. Say, you have feelings, but the language that we speak compels you to say, you have feelings, as if you were something on the one hand and your feelings were something else on the other. You say, you have thoughts, as if the thinker stands on the one hand and inspects the thoughts on the other. So that one has a view of life in which there is a panorama of thoughts, of feelings, of sensations, going along constantly. But one can say constantly because of the impression that you are distinct from them, standing aside from them as the constant inspector of the procession. And so you get the feeling that you endure, but precariously, threatenedly, while the procession of thoughts and feelings goes by you. Now, you can very easily see that this is the result of the memory process, which gives an illusion of constancy in the flow. And therefore, in the same way that the famous old Buddhist analogy, when you rotate a burning brand in the darkness, you give the illusion of a continuous circle of fire because of the memory in the retina, where the impression of the spark doesn't fade out immediately, but lingers. And so, as you see this thing in front of your eye, it seems to form a circle, whereas there is no circle, there is only a moment. The instant of flame. So Buddhists argue. There is only this moment. And actually, you who come in at the door are not the same people who are now sitting here. Just as in the whirlpool in water, there is no constant water. There is only going on a continuous behavior, whirling in the water, but no water stays in it. So in exactly the same way, you who came into the door a few minutes ago and are now sitting here are entirely different. Only you are clinging to the idea of your continuity. Actually, there is only the moment, the instant, what is called in Sanskrit the kshana, K-S-A-N-A, kshana. Life is instantaneous. And if you see that, you get a kind of a new angle on St. Paul's famous pronouncement that we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, on the morning when the last trumpet sounds. You see, the Christian has put everything into chronology. That there is going to be a thing called the last day, and the trumpet of the angels is going to awaken the dead. The trumpet sounding now, you see, for the Buddhists. Wake up! There is this moment. And this is eternity. Only you are stringing the moments together, and you are creating time out of eternity. You are wondering, you are identifying yourself, in other words, with all the things that have happened to me. And you're worrying about all the things that will. But actually, you are never anywhere but now. This is a very interesting discipline that is given in all systems of yoga and Buddhist meditation. The student is told to live in the present completely, to never relax awareness of what you are doing now. Be here. So you would say, in the ordinary way, I have thoughts about tomorrow and yesterday, and I'm distracted. My mind doesn't stay focused on the present. That's the way it seems, yes. So what you do instead is you try to focus your attention completely on the present. You find this a very difficult thing to do, because you don't know when the present is. In other words, you don't recognize that anything happens until it's already a memory. It has, as it were, to be in your consciousness long enough to make an impression. And you say, well, in looking at this table, I wish I could find something different from tables to give illustrations from. All lecturers are always talking about tables. In looking at this pipe, I don't know it's here until somehow or other it has lingered. So I ask, am I actually knowing the present pipe? Or is it always past? So as you continue to practice this exercise, you get the funny feeling that your memory of something past is also a present event. Do you see? You have the memory, it is here. And this begins to bug you, like it did St. Augustine. He couldn't understand memory. He got into a terrible tailspin about it. Because, you see, the memory of the past is something always present. So you finally realize that the whole exercise you're undertaking was pointless. Because there is nowhere else to be but the present. But that was the point of trying to make you do this thing. To get you to realize that there is no past and there is no future. There is only now, and you can't get out of it. So relax. You're in eternity, in the moment. And this flows along, or flows doesn't flow. You know this thing of Tennyson's poem, such a tide as moving seems to sleep, too full for sound or foam. The unmoved mover, the idea of somehow motion and stillness going together, activity and peace, the eye of the hurricane. You see, everything is really like that. Well, now, all that I've said hitherto is introductory to going on for this seminar to discuss the second great point of view that is involved in Mahayana Buddhism. The first, the Madhyamika, the middle way, was, as I said, to destroy all your hang-ups, fixed opinions about the nature of life, so that you don't use ideas, beliefs, religious prejudices, preferences, opinions. You don't use them to cling. It demolishes every idea of reality that you could have. That's Madhyamika, that's Nagarjuna. Now, a little later in time, there arose in India two other great Buddhist philosophers, respectively Asanga, A-S-A-N-G-A, and Vasubandhu, V-A-S-U-B-A-N-D-H-U. There may have been two Vasubandhus, either father and son, or teacher and student who took his teacher's name. And they lived in this vague dating that we have. It's impossible to pin it down, about 400 A.D. And they are responsible for what is called the Yogacara school. That's yoga, Y-O-G-A-C-A-R-A. Yogacara. Sometimes called also Vijñapti Matra, which means the school of consciousness only. And it looks deceptively like what we call in Western philosophy subjective idealism, as taught, say, by Berkeley or Bradley. That, in other words, the only reality is your mind, as this is propounded in Western philosophy. Everything that exists is in your mind. You know an external world only in your mind. You know the sense of space between yourself and something distant from you. That is a mental phenomenon. And so it could be argued that your mind alone exists, and that all that you see is an imagination. The extreme way of posing this is the doctrine called solipsism, that there is only yourself and that everything else is your dream.
There has never been any way of disproving this, except my idea, which I think almost disproves it, that I would like to be present at a conference of solipsists, where they argue as to which one of them is the one that's really there. So, the point of view of, say, Berkeley or Bradley in the Western tradition of subjective idealism is not solipsistic. But it is that everybody has a certain independent existence, but as a mind, and that all particular minds are, as it were, minds in a supermind, which is the mind of God. Now, so the Western philosopher has therefore dealt with the problem. Does something exist when there's nobody around to look at it, you see? By saying, there was a young man who said, God, I find it exceedingly odd that a tree as a tree simply ceases to be when there's no one around in the quad. Young man, your astonishment's odd. I'm always around in the quad, so the tree as a tree never ceases to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. But this isn't the same point of view that we're going to deal with in Oriental philosophy, because we start from completely different assumptions as to the nature of mind and matter. And you see, if you don't get those straight, you confuse the Yogacara school with subjective idealism. Unfortunately, Professor Takakusu, in his book, The Essentials of Buddhist Philosophy, uses Western school names to classify the different types of Buddhist philosophy. And this is, he uses, nihilism, subjective idealism, etc., all down the line. And this is very confusing. Because when you start with the basic idea of what is mind, you don't begin with the opposition that we begin with, which is mind-matter. You begin instead with the contrast mind and form. And form is furthermore broken down into name and form. It is called in Sanskrit nama-rupa. N-A-M-A, that is name, same word. Rupa, R-U-P-A, name, form. And this stands in their system as distinct from the idea of matter meaning stuff in our common sense. So you see, we begin with this break, that we have the notion that there is some kind of heavy, hard substance. And this substance is energized by spiritual forces, which, just as the potter turns clay into pots, the spiritual forces take hold of the unintelligent stuff of matter and weave it into all the various shapes of life. And so then, when we die, here is a person, you see, who was going along, was talking, chatting, doing his business every day, and suddenly, zingo, his body lies there. Where is he? What's happened to him? Well, of course, the mind has left, and there dies only the stuff. See? So we've got this idea in our minds of the energy, which is something impalpable, something unstuff, you see, animating or not animating something that is heavy and hard and dusty. Now that great contrast, which comes, of course, from the book of Genesis, from the idea that the Lord God formed the world out of some clay. Adam was a clay figurine. This idea is not in the same way in Hindu thought. But something deceptively like it is in Hindu thought, which causes the confusion. For example, Shankara, who is the great interpreter of the Upanishads, in the tradition of interpretation which is called the Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual Vedanta, sometimes uses the symbol of gold and things made of gold, which sounds like the pots and the clay, but he uses it in another way than we do. Whereas we use the clay as the symbol for the stuff out of which things are made, and which is inferior because the shape, being spiritual, is more important than the stuff. He uses it in exactly the opposite way. He says all beings are of the nature of the divine, just as many different objects can be made out of gold. It is all one gold, though the shape may change, and he describes, you see, the shape as ephemeral and impermanent. But it is the gold which is the thing that endures. You see that using the analogy, the metaphor, in an exactly opposite way from the way we use clay or stuff and form in the West. So then, you don't have, at the basis of the mind-only philosophy, a conception of mind which is the kind of impalpable spook presiding over the hard and heavy stuff. You have to begin somewhere else altogether. And this is the fascination of studying Oriental culture, that you have to readjust your own common sense to get at it. What on earth do these people mean? Especially when I don't really have any words in my own language into which I can translate their ideas. Now, fortunately, it isn't all that inaccessible. Because what we have here is not merely words. If that were all, we would be absolutely lost. But we have the techniques, the meditation disciplines, which you can use, and through using them, find out what it was that they meant, experimentally. So then, we start basically with the fundamental word that is used in Sanskrit for the activity of mind, and this is chitta. We Romanize this as C-I-T-T-A. The root chit, C-I-T, is basic to mind. Now, the Sanskrit language has many words for mind. We have this one word, mind, which sort of has to take care of everything. We've got intellect, we've got vision, consciousness, and so on, but they're all very vague in the way they're used. Sanskrit is quite precise. But chit is the basic term. And reality itself is called in Vedanta philosophy Sat Chit Ananda. Sat means real. This word, the root sa, in Sanskrit, is what is manifest and is really there. It comes from breathing out. You make the sound sa. And so it's really there. Chit is conscious.
as the quality of consciousness. Ananda means bliss. Because reality, if not blissful, would not be. The game has to be worth the candle, or it would stop. If the fundamental impulse and energy of the universe were not blissful, the whole system would have ceased long ago. Even if it involves pain, this pain is masochistic. That is to say, it is pain being enjoyed fundamentally as a pleasure, like you can have a grievance and make your whole life a cause around your grievance. Like being a professionally rejected woman or a failure of some kind, and you can really build this up into a big thing, you see. And so, in this funny sort of rather trivial human way, you make an ecstasy out of suffering. And the idea here is that the universe is fundamentally, insofar as it involves suffering, making an ecstasy out of it. That is to say, that every element of pain in the whole scheme of things is the necessary, what will I call it, contrasting element that you need in order to bring out the fundamental exuberance and joy of being. That you wouldn't know, in other words, that you were here unless something stopped you. Now, mind, in this philosophy, what is meant by chit, is practically exactly the same thing as we mean by existence. When we use the word being, and in order to, for example, when Dr. Johnson heard of Berkeley's philosophy, that everything existed only in your mind, his response was to kick a stone, as if to demonstrate, that's the real world. But it is exactly this sense of that is meant by chit. And that's why when a Zen master, would be asked, what is the fundamental meaning of Buddhism? He answers, help! This sense of impact, of the boom, that is what it is. In other words, mind in this philosophy is as concrete as you can imagine. And so it is called, and we will in a future seminar go into this from another point of view, the word Vagra, which means diamond, is used for it. Because the diamond is simultaneously the hardest thing there is and the most transparent. So there's a whole philosophy of Buddhism worked around the image of the diamond. So what you've got here, you see, is a conception of mind which, instead of being the impalpable, ghostly thing that we have had, is the most intensely tough reality, the adamantine mind. Bang, hard, you, here, you see, this very strong sense of being. So the philosophy of it's all in your mind has to be hung on this as distinctive from being hung on something flimsy and impalpable. Now we're going to have an intermission. This is part of a series of seminars on the future. And last weekend, we were discussing the very nature of time
And I want to give a sort of summary of what we were talking about before going into this particular weekend's discussion, which is the future of communication. Last weekend, we discussed the idea that history, the notion of human life as a kind of progressive system that is beginning from the old, the primitive, the worn out, the stupid, and going on progressively to the greater and greater attainments, the wise, the good, the successful, and so on, that this is a very dangerous illusion. That insofar as we feel we are participating in and improving human life through the course of history, we are actually destroying ourselves. Because everything that so far, through technology and through the accumulation of human skill, we call the increase of our powers, is leading us to destruction. Not because technology in itself is a bad thing, but because the spirit in which it is used is a spirit of man against the universe, man against nature. And man has to realize that he is an integral part of nature, that he is just as much a natural form as a seagull or a wave or a mountain. And if he doesn't realize that, he uses his technical powers to destroy his environment, to foul his own nest. And so when you look at a great modern city like Los Angeles, and you see the absolute ruination of what used to be a very lovely natural scene, full of citrus trees and sunshine, now turned into a smoggy slum. So the Los Angelization instead of civilization of the world is a result of having a sense of our own existence which is contrary to the facts. That is to say, we are all trained by our parents, by our teachers, by our peer groups, to experience our own existence as an ego in a capsule of skin, confronted by an external world which is not ourselves, definitely not. And that this external world is something that really threatens us because we've been brought up to the idea that basically it's mechanism. It's a stupid, unintelligent manifestation of energy. Right out in the farthest galaxies, it's nothing but fire and gas. Nearer to us, it's nothing but water and rock. And it's full of buzzing insects and other organisms that are inferior to the human status, and therefore something that's not to be trusted at all. And we have been brought up to the idea that we come into this scene as if we were complete strangers to it. We're born by an accident of bad rubber goods or something like that. And we arrive in this and confront it like that. See? It's outside there. And this is a hallucination. All this is a complete fantasy. Official people in psychiatry complain about the hallucinatory states induced by LSD and so on and so forth, but they are nothing. They are nothing in their hallucinations compared with the hallucination of being a skin-encapsulated ego. One is not that.
For example, it's a very, very, very simple. A human being exists by virtue of living in a world where there are plants, where there is air, where there is water, where there is sun and its temperature. And plants imply insects and grubs. They can't live without them. And grubs imply birds. And birds imply fish. And so on and so on. It all fits together so that you are patterns. Every living organism is a pattern of something which is inseparable from the pattern of everything else that is going on. So that you could say, you as a living human organism are something that the whole universe is doing at the point of space and time which you call here and now. You are not separate. You flow into all that surrounds you in exactly the same way that your head goes with your feet. See, they're inseparable. When you were born, you weren't put together like one constructs an automobile, screwing on this bit and screwing on that bit and so on. You beautifully grew, head and feet together, all of one piece, from your mother's womb. And in exactly the same way that your head and your feet are related together, so you go with. I want to get this word into the English language. Go with. Instead of cause and effect, instead of that mechanical understanding of the world, which was Descartes and Newton, they thought of the world as billiards. You hit a ball and it goes, and it hits that ball like that, you see. And they thought of cause and effect. You don't need to use that concept at all. Go with. Just as a front goes with the back, just as a top goes with the bottom, just as up goes with down, they're inseparable. So in exactly that way, you go with everything that you call the external world. And therefore you have to treat the external world as if it were as much you as your own foot or your own head. It's part of you. It is you. There's no way of separating them. Therefore you have to be very kind and reverent and respectful to the mountains, to the forests, and so on, to the water, to the fish. You, for example, live on fish, just as birds live on worms. And if you kill any creature in order to live, you have a duty towards it. That is to say, you must not exterminate the species on which you live. People have, for example, in the whaling industry, they have practically exterminated whales. And it's becoming a very serious situation because you must farm, cultivate every species on which you feed. If all worms were to be eaten by the birds would have no further sustenance. From the worm's point of view, if all birds were to vanish, the worms would overpopulate themselves and starve themselves. So the worms depend on the birds just as much as the birds depend on the worms. So we all depend on the whole interaction of the system of biology. It's a mutual eating society. You may say, that's too bad, that life has to involve this crunching and crushing and annihilation of other creatures. But that's the way it is.
And therefore, if that's the way it is, the way to do it properly is, number one, to farm instead of merely destroy. Be assured that the species you feed on is maintained, that it goes on. Farm the whales, don't just hunt them. That's the first principle. The second principle is, whenever you destroy a living body for your own maintenance, give it the honor of cooking it as beautifully as possible. A fish that has died for you and is not well cooked has died in vain. I'm quoting Lin Yutang. So this is the situation in which we find ourselves. Life is a system in which organisms, by mutual eating, transform fish into people, grass into people, lettuce into people, cows into people. What about people? What are they transformed into? We are proud, too proud, and we try to resist our transformation into some other forms of life. And therefore we have a wretched profession of morticians, otherwise known as undertakers, who try to embalm us and preserve us and put us in concrete and bury us, instead of letting us simply join the biological rhythm. Actually, what should happen when a person is dead is that they should be buried 3 feet underground with no casket, nothing, just naked in the earth. And that field should be allowed to lie fallow for some years. And then it would be beautifully fertilized by human bodies, and crops would grow out of it. They always say that the best wheat is grown on old battlefields. But you see, we resist that. And the morticians will put an ad in with some girl who's lost her husband looking out of the window on a rainy day. They say, trust us, he's not rotting really, you know. We've got that concrete thing, we've got that extra special covering, that super embalming, and the corpse is still there. Baby, don't worry. You know, how mad can you get? How insane, how ridiculous. The root of this kind of disturbance, of feeling that you are separate inside your skin and not simply all one process with everything that's going on around you. The root of this is a failure of communication. Now, if I want to talk about communication, one of the funny things that occurs to me straight off is that the subject of communication is really the same subject as life. Life is communication. But let's take the subject of advertising. Life is advertising. Because the moment, what is advertising doing? Advertising is trying to promote somebody's gain, somebody's existence, somebody's biological reality, because he's maintaining himself by selling something, and he advertises it so as to sell it. So one could say that all life is advertising. Everybody advertises himself in some way or other. Or take another subject, strategy, military strategy. All life can be seen as a form of strategy. Any major department of human life that we classify, we can call it business, we can call it strategy, we can call it advertising, we can call it communication. But we can see all life as that. How then are we going to define communication as a particular human activity, as distinct from other activities? What is the difference between communication and architecture?
What is the difference between communication and playing on the stock market? What is the difference between communication and football? These are very, very difficult things to define because there is no difference. Football is a form of communication. Sex is a form of communication. There isn't anything that we do that isn't a form of communication. And therefore, you may say, why talk about communication? Because it's everything anyhow. So, in order to define the field, I'm going to talk about communication more narrowly. Communication is language. Communication is the world of symbols. It's true, sexual intercourse is a form of communication. But I'm not going to include that sort of activity in what we're going to discuss. What I'm going to talk about is the way in which human beings use noises, like words, and symbols, like numbers, to represent the things which go on in the material and physical world. If you take a glass of water and you drink it and you taste that, you see, that is an event in the physical universe. But the word water is also in the physical universe because it's a sound. But that particular sound, water, is used in a way that is peculiar. It is used to represent that transparent liquid that you drink. So alongside the physical universe of people and everything that's going on, there is another universe that we have invented of words and signs and numbers that represent the physical world. And we are very, very preoccupied with this symbolic world. And we very often confuse it with what it represents. Especially this is true in the United States of America. This is a country, a nation, a culture, which is devoted in a most peculiar way to symbols. Not so long ago, the Congress of the United States voted very serious penalties against anybody who burned or mutilated the American flag. That same group of people is responsible for burning and destroying the physical landscape and population of the United States of America. They will not properly resist the depravities of lumber companies who are destroying the redwood forests, the watersheds, the industries who foul our streams, deprive us of water, poison the air. That's all fine, just so long as you don't destroy the flag. The flag is the symbol, only the symbol, of the physical country. But they, instead of protecting the physical country, protect the symbol. In the same way, exactly, people confuse money with wealth. Money is paper, is bookkeeping, is a useful method of avoiding the inconveniences of barter. But money has become something to possess in its own right. To have more money than you can possibly need. You know the joke about if somebody gives you $1 million on the condition that you spend it all in one day,
what would you buy with? And certain things are excluded, like you mustn't buy an enormous real estate thing. You just have to spend it on things that you could use. And it's a very difficult problem as to how you would spend $1 million in a day. Think it out realistically. But when you get this obsession with money as a reality, as if it was something that actually was desirable, you get an entirely hallucinated population. People who simply don't know what's good for them. And are, as, shall we say, intoxicated, addicted to money, as if they were all on heroin or opium. This is the confusion of the symbol with what it's supposed to represent. So then, let's inquire carefully into the origin of all this, because before we explore the future of communication, through symbols, through words, we've got to look a little bit at its past. At some point in the development of mankind, and nobody historically knows how long ago this is, we developed two things. One of them was the ability to scan, to pay attention, to use our consciousness in a focused way. In other words, to notice what's going on. Ordinarily, we depend to an enormous extent on a kind of consciousness that doesn't notice. That is to say, you are functioning all the time, breathing, beating your heart, even driving a car while you're absorbed in conversation with your friendly passenger. You're doing an enormous number of things very well indeed without noticing what you're doing. Your entire physical existence, as a matter of fact, goes on and maintains itself without your noticing anything about it. So your faculty of noticing has the same relationship to your total organism as, say, on a ship. The radar is scanning the environment, looking for trouble. That's all it looks for another ship that it might collide with, for a rock, for the proper entrance to San Francisco in the middle of the fog. That's what the radar is looking for. But besides the radar, there are all kinds of things going on a ship that are much more fundamental and essential to it. So in the same way, in the human organism, we have a radar. We call it conscious attention. And we are constantly scanning our environment and noticing this and that as to whether it is advantageous to us or disadvantageous. But that's only a little frippery on the top of us. Useful, yes, important, but it's not you. The real you is the you that is beating the heart, shaping the bones, all that. And we have learned, you see, by a curious social process, to identify ourselves, our very selves, what I say is the real me. We've identified that with the scanning process, the little radar job, instead of identifying it with the whole total organism. And therefore we are estranged from our own bodies. And by virtue of being estranged from the body, we are in turn estranged from the physical environment of nature. If you understood, if you really clearly realized that you are your own organism, you would at the same moment feel, because your organism knows it, that you were one with your environment. this organism is related to the world outside it in exactly the same way that, say, a whirlpool in a river is related to the river. Everything outside you is sort of creating you by flowing through you and humaning, bodying, just as when the river moves, it whirlpools and then goes on. So the entire physical universe is peopling all around here, you see. But conscious attention doesn't deliver that to us as an experience. Why? Because conscious attention, or noticing, is a function of consciousness which is separative instead of unitive. It analyzes instead of synthesizing. I don't want to, by saying this sort of thing, to put it down and say it's a mistake and something that shouldn't have happened.